Welcome back to the Bible's Art. In this video, I want to look at the new Gnosticism of figures like Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke. Let me start out by saying that I am a fan of Jordan Peterson. I am willing to fly that flag. I love what he's doing. But I think there are some things, a pattern I see amongst him and other figures like John Vervaeke that I think is sort of sneaking in kind of unnoticed. And that thing is the belief that you can have meaning without metaphysics. That is, you can get objective meaning in the world without reality. Here's what I mean. When people ask Jordan Peterson about his belief in God or whether he's a Christian, there's sort of endless deferral of the question. And he says things like, it's a very complex question. What do you mean by this? That is, at very least, there's a sort of bracketing or putting aside of the question of the metaphysics, the reality, the ontology of God and his ontological commitments, what you actually believe to be the case about these things. Similarly, in his thought about the Bible, you have similar deferrals. That is, deferrals about whether this stuff actually happened. Similarly, with John Vervaeke, of whom there are many things in his work that I do appreciate, but once again, he shares a similar proposition with Jordan Peterson, and that is his focus on practices, the belief that the question of ontology, of meaning, can be extracted from the practices themselves, and the thought that you can have everything you had before as long as you take these practices and do them. That is, your commitments towards this metaphysic, this story, this ontology are not very important, if important at all. Now, there's an important thing to know about this stream of thought, and that is, it's not new. This is just old liberal historical criticism like Boltzmann. That is, they think that even though you've thrown away much of the sort of historicity of these stories, the ontology, the metaphysics of it, it doesn't matter because either the story itself or the practices of the community can still provide you with everything that was provided before with the story itself. Now, of course, this didn't start with Boltzmann or any of the other liberals. It goes back to Kant, who separated the phenomena and the noumena, that is, what appears to us and the reality, the thing in itself. And Kant thought that, reality itself got filtered through these categories in our heads of substance, quantity, all of these things like that. So it's nothing new. But Peterson and John Vervaeke share that same fundamental proposition that you can have meaning without metaphysics. And I think this happens because when you explain a story or practice in a fascinating or interesting ways, when you unfold these things like these two gentlemen do in compelling ways, you sort of can paper over the question of the foundations of these things. And you can sort of implicitly convince people that, the reality is no longer necessary. But this is obviously false. Now, this new Gnosticism, that's not entirely new, is very out of step with Western thought. Because one of the features of Western thought is that in the Christian faith coheres both the beautiful and the true, and that you cannot have one without the other. And if you rip them apart, you lose them both. And this is sort of an obvious proposition. What is obvious? Well, the reality that you need to have both the practices, the surface, the aesthetic structure, the symbolism, and the truth of it. This is literally a presupposition of the entirety of our lives, every single practice we partake in life. Let me give you an example. Marriage. You cannot have the story of marriage or the practices of marriage without marriage. You don't exchange rings, have the ritual of a ceremony, the liturgy of words, and not actually marry someone. And that's because practices only have their meaning within a true context. The rituals, the practices of marriage only make sense within marriage. And it sounds silly even to say that because it's so obviously true. The same is true with your job. You don't do the practices of your vocation without being employed. If you work at a big law firm, you can't just show up, sit at a desk, take lunch breaks, and not actually be employed there in reality, in being ontologically employed. We actually have developed names and vocabulary for when you do the practices but don't actually participate in the reality. We either call it a play or theater or pretend, or at worst, hypocrisy. I think one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson has become such a compelling figure, and I think that's true, is because he is recovering and carrying on important parts of the Western philosophical and theological tradition, but only some parts of them. That is, he carries on the moral rhetoric where he is commanding people to do things when largely moral imperative has fallen out of pedagogical discourse. That is, your professors don't typically tell you that you should do things, and a sort of Western psychological tradition where you have virtues and vices that goes back to the biblical text through Augustine and Aquinas. But what is left out is the grounding for those things, like the main thing. And so in the end, what these men are offering is they're saying, hey, I want you to put on a play. That is, do these practices or tell yourself these stories. It's like putting on a play of marriage, but never actually getting married. Now, this might seem like a strange video for me to make and a channel that's devoted to the literary artistry of the Bible, where so much of my time is focused on the aesthetic, the surface art of this text. But this foundational principle of the Bible being a literary artwork is undergirded by a much more fundamental belief that I have, and that is that the world is art, and that the biblical text is a mirror. It is an interpretation of what is actually true in reality. The biblical text is training our eyes to be able to interpret the world correctly in reality. And that's because meaning and metaphysics, form and substance, are one in the biblical worldview. Meaning is recovered not simply through retelling and understanding the stories, the surface, the structure of it, or by participating in the practices, but participating in the actual story. That is, the answer to phenomenology and fundamentalism is to say that the Bible is both true and beautiful, that reality is both true and beautiful, that the story of the Bible and the story of Jesus is the hero's journey because it is the hero's journey in real life. Okay, but you might say, well, what about stories? What about fiction? That's important, right? And yes, that is absolutely important. But the only reason that stories, that fiction exist and are effective both in their aesthetic and educational import is because they live inside a larger story that is true in real life. Here's what I mean. Fictional stories that have been written and that perdure throughout humanity, not silly ones that fizzle out, but true ones that exist for long periods of time, do so and are effective because they presuppose a certain structure to the world, a certain moral structure and psychological structure. They presuppose that. And that structure that they presuppose about moral virtues and vices, about God and man, that is true. It's metaphysically true. It's ontologically true. So when you're writing stories, you are permutating, you're imagining scenarios within this ontology, within this world. And so fictional stories work. they can work and be effective in transformation only if they exist within the true story. In the words of C.S. Lewis, the one true myth. So while I appreciate these gentlemen very much, there is a giant hole in the middle of their work that cannot be ignored. That is reality. Thank you so much for checking out this video. I very much appreciate it. Please leave your questions or comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.